this time of the year, when the air gets crisper, the light stays dimmer and everything is starting to slow down, I feel the most creative. It almost feels like with the buzzing of the summer ebbing away, it gets easier for me to listen to my thoughts and ideas. I want to sit in my studio all day and sew while the rain is gently tapping against the windows. So, just like last year, I'm going to make something from tulle for the witchy season we are currently entering. Only this time it's a ghost cape. If you are following me on Instagram, you may remember this cape and my promise that I would release a pattern for it. The problem is that there was never an existing pattern. It was a one-day make, completely improvised, without any notes or patterns to recreate it. So, before I'm able to digitalize a pattern I can send to people to test out in order to release it in the future, I first have to make a pattern and refine it. I wasn't really in the mood to do a mock-up, and since October came around with a lot of those ghostly pictures all over Instagram and Pinterest, I tried to motivate myself with a little compromise. Instead of doing a simple mock-up, I recreated the pattern and made a ghost cape out of tulle from it. I wrote down all the changes I still have to make to the pattern while sewing the cape, as well as some notes and instructions that will be helpful to make the cape in the future. I already knew a few things I wanted to change from the original cape, like the size of the bow in the back, the volume of the sleeves, as well as the angle of the lower part. So I already planned it for the tulle version. After finishing the sketch, I was really excited to start and see how the cape will look once finished. To recreate the pattern, I simply laid the original cape onto my pattern paper and traced around it. I never did it this way before, since most of the time I start with a pattern and not with the finished garment, so I traced it as carefully as possible, measuring a few times to make sure everything matched and hoped it will turn out right. I could only trace the front and the back of the sleeves, since everything else will be drafted later, once the first pieces are assembled. So, after tracing both the sides, I put the original cape aside and started with the new one. When sewing a project for YouTube, I always try to use fabric I already have in my stash. So this time I was happy to use all the tulle scraps that come up when sewing large tulle skirts. And since they are piling up right now, it is a good opportunity to use them for this project. So the first step now was to organize all those scraps, iron them and see which one I can use for which part of the cape. Every time I iron tulle, I get questions about how this is possible without damaging the fabric. With this particular type of tulle, I know that it can be ironed very easily because I used it so often. But whenever I work with a new fabric, I always try how it reacts to heat, steam and pressure, and I really try to find out the limits of the fabric. I don't mind destroying a tiny spot when it helps to determine how to handle the rest of the fabric. So since I know now how long and hot I can iron the fabric, it is really easy to get it smooth again. The last step before starting to prepare the pieces is to check how many tulle layers I want to use. Since layering tool gives different options in the opacity, I really want to make sure to find the right one between creating a ghost-like overlay while still showing the lines of the garment. So, for the sleeves I settled with 2 layers of tulle for each, outside and lining layer, having 4 layers in total at the sleeves. Then I laid each pattern piece onto my ironing board and placed the tulle layers on top of it. After making sure the grain line of both tulle layers matched the pattern piece, I pinned everything to the ironing board. This way nothing moves while tracing around the pattern. For this, I used an extra basting thread and slowly worked my way around it, making sure to stay exactly on the lines. This took quite a while with 8 pieces I had to trace, but it's a task I enjoy very much. There are a lot of steps where you have to think about what to do, so just tracing something and letting your thoughts wander for a bit is a nice change. I decided to do 8 pieces because this way I created a lining layer and an outer layer, so I could finish all the insides with French seams. Tulle can get quite scratchy, and even though this type of bridal tulle is very soft and feels great when you touch it, unfinished edges still tend to scratch a bit. So with all the edges turned inside and finished with French seams, I could avoid that while also adding some clean lines to the cape with the more opaque seams. When you still find tulle to be too scratchy this way, you could always add a layer of another see-through fabric closest to your skin. After preparing all the sleeve parts, I had to do the bow as well as the 2 small back panels. Here I used 4 layers of tulle, loosely basting or pinning them together, and then sewing all the layers together with a wide stitch on the sewing machine to save some time. By using the wide stitch, I could then pull out the tension the sewing machine created, iron the pieces, and cut them into the right shape and length. Seeing how little of the tulle scraps were left after cutting all the pieces made me very happy. Now I had the 2 front and back panels for the outer layer, as well as the front and back panels for the lining layer, the 4 bow pieces and the 4 back panels. With them I could then slowly start the assembling. Sewing French seams, and especially with see-through fabric, it is important to have an even seam allowance, otherwise it is going to look weird. So I try to make it as easy as possible for me to have the same size everywhere by using the measurements of the foot from my sewing machine. First, I placed the foot exactly next to the basted line and sew next to it, always keeping the same distance. Then I cut away the seam allowance, making sure what's left is less than the distance from the previous sewn seam to the basted line. After that, everything needs to be turned inside out, so first I iron the seam open, then turn everything and then iron it again very carefully, making sure nothing is crooked. Then I can remove the basting thread, because now I can use the foot of the sewing machine again to sew at the perfect distance from the initial seam. Then everything needs to be ironed and turned again, and you can see the even French seam from the right side through the fabric. Sewing this kind of seams takes some practice and is a lot easier to do on straight seams than on curved ones, so I always start with the easier ones to get everything right. When the curves are narrow, I sometimes cut into the first seam allowance to give it a bit more tolerance before sewing the second seam, but you always have to check beforehand if the fabric can stretch around those curves without pulling on the seam. A little trick for this is to make sure while cutting out the pattern pieces from the fabric that those curves are cut on the bias to give the fabric a bit more stretch where it's needed. After preparing the sleeves 4 times, making sure not to sew only left sleeves, for example, which can easily happen when the fabric is see-through and doesn't have clear left or right side, it's time to close the front of both lining and outer sleeves. This was again done by sewing a small French seam. With both lining and outside top ready, I could sew them together at the bottom in the front and back, making sure to leave a small part under the arm open, where I will later add the bottom part of the cape. Here I used French seams again, and it was the most confusing thing I ever sewed. Sewing the initial cape was so easy and quick, but with the tulle and all the French seams where you have to lay the wrong sides onto each other, this step was very confusing and I was relieved when I got it done. The next step was then to add the straps of the bow that I prepared earlier. They were also done by sewing French seams, turning everything inside out, and then carefully ironing them flat, making sure to really stretch them to the right size so that they are as straight as possible. Then I sewed each one to the back of the cape and finished the inside by hand. The last step on the top part was then to secure both layers together at the top, sew them together and then trim away the seam allowance. Then it was time to work on the bottom part of the cape. Since I wasn't sure how to angle the bottom, I pinned it to the top to see how I want to secure it. Then I cut the right angle and prepared all 4 pieces. I needed this angle so that I could cut the 2 layers that will be added to the bottom. Here I decided to do 2 layers since they would look more dense due to the gathering. Those are then secured at the top so that they don't shift and sewn together at the sewing machine with the white gathering stitch. The 4 pieces I prepared earlier are then sewn together again using French seams, leaving out the same amount like on the top, where the 2 parts will be sewn together in the end. I always make sure to press everything carefully because this way it keeps its shape a lot better. With this oddly shaped piece ready, I could then divide the bottom of it in equal parts and repeat it on the top of the 2 big tulle layers, so that I can then add both parts together. Now I can gather the bigger parts by pulling the thread, and I have a big amount of fabric equally divided onto a small length. After sewing both pieces together, the only thing that was left now was to add both bottom and top part together and finish the raw edges on the inside of the bottom piece as well as on the front of it. And with that, I finished the tulle cape. I had a lot of fun creating this cape. Even though it is a simple design with only a few pattern pieces, it looks very elegant. The French seams are contrasting with the sheer fabric and showing off the clean lines of the cape without taking away from its softness. Initially, I wanted to add cuffs to the sleeves but ran out of time, which I'm not too sad about because I think the free hem of the sleeves add to the ghostly look of the cape. I loved working on the project, and in the end it was a lot more difficult than I anticipated, but I really enjoyed the challenge. I used almost all the tulle scraps and finished the cape in 3 days. Working on it really got me into the mood for cold weather and rain. And now, please excuse me while I go scare the neighbors a bit more walking around in my ghost cape at dawn. Thank you for watching, and until next time.